So let me just welcome everyone then. So we've called this session Lockdowns to Contact Tracing, Covid-19 and the Dilemmas of Freedom. For those of you that haven't met me, I'm Alastair. I'm the convener of the Living Freedom School and secretary of the Battle of Ideas charity. Very keen to reorganise the Living Freedom event in London. But in the meantime, we wanted to use the time that we've got to be able to experiment a little with these online events. So today, we're going to try an online panel discussion. So we thought that rather than having a lecture on some of these issues, that it would actually be better just to bring together 4 or 5 people in a panel, let them have a few reflections on what they think are the important challenges, and then we can have a conversation together to see if we can work a few things out. And you know, there are lots of differences. I think some people have a completely different take on what the immediate challenges are in terms of freedom. Other people have a different take on what's the main problem. You know, is it the state? Is it kind of closing down of civil society? Some people see lots of genuine dilemmas, I think, in the circumstances. To what extent does safety become something that we're prepared to trade off against freedom? You know, is this an unprecedented situation where we just have to accept that some of our freedoms do come under constraint? And how to respond to things like conspiracy theories or fake news, misinformation. So there's lots of issues on the table, I think, that we can look at. There's all sorts of dilemmas as well, I think, around individual autonomy and how we exercise our freedom. You know, at a time of lockdown, I might want out of the lockdown, but it is the case that if you look at all the surveys just now, it's pretty much unanimous opinion that we should remain in the lockdown. So kind of what does it mean in terms of exercising individual freedom at a time when a wider set of views exists that we should do the exact opposite? So I think we have an opportunity here to delve into some of these issues. We've got 5 speakers to give us some opening thoughts. So let me introduce my speakers in the order that they're going to speak on. First up, we're going to have Inaya, Folarin, Iman, who's co-director of the Free Speech Union, which was recently set up to defend free speech as the bedrock, I suppose, of our freedoms. Inaya's formerly project manager in Index on Censorship. She's a writer, and I think you should be looking to check out some of the long-form YouTube videos that she started to do over recent weeks, which are really good, interesting attempt at exploring some of the key issues that we face today. So welcome to you, Inaya. We've got JacobM, who's the executive director at Justitia, a Copenhagen-based human rights think tank. He's also the host and the narrator of a fantastic podcast called Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech. Hour-long episodes. I think there's 40 available so far. So if anybody's looking for things to do within this lockdown, I cannot recommend anything more highly than revisiting some of those podcasts. And they're kind of rewarding trawl through the history of free speech. Thirdly, we'll have Daniel Moylan, who's co-chairman at Urban Design London. He's the former deputy leader of Kensington Chelsea Council, a regular speaker over the years at our Battle of Ideas Festival, always got an interesting perspective on whatever it is that he's speaking about. Personally, I first came across Daniel almost 20 years ago, I think, when he was at Kensington Chelsea Council, where he was trying to push through the redesign of a lot of the urban design roads and public spaces within Kensington. And at that time, there was such a massive rules and regulations against what people wanted to do that Daniel was very much the guy that was responsible for experimenting and even taking on liability and personal responsibility for some of those changes. So he's very much kind of someone who's up for challenging authority and a bit of a risk taker, I think, Daniel. So welcome to you. It's really nice to have you here. Fourth up, we'll have Ian McWhirter, columnist at the Herald. He's been a prominent broadcaster for more than 20 years, author of a book called Disunited Kingdom, and also a very good pamphlet called Democracy in the Dark, Decline of the Scottish Press and How to Keep the Lights On. I don't think it overflatters you, Ian, to say that you're the columnist that I think is the kind of first in the list of things that I would read in the Scottish press every week. Brilliant reflections on what's going on in Scotland that I think also have a kind of wider, more universal value in terms of the issues that you're looking at. So fantastic to have you here. And finally, we'll have Claire Fox, who's director of the Academy of Ideas. The founder 15 years ago of the Battle of Ideas Festival, a commentator widely on all sorts of broadcast and print media. And I think useful to point out here, she's the author of a very important book on freedom called I Still Find That Offensive, which is in its second edition. And also the longest running panelist on Radio 4's Moral Maze. And I think a lot of these issues are quite tricky sort of moral conundrums around freedom. So it's great to have Claire with us today. So finally, if I can just say a couple of words about the format. I've asked each of them to speak for 5 minutes, just give us a few reflections on what it is that interests them about the challenges to freedom just now. So, with no further ado, Inaya, over to you.
I guess, yeah, I think that there are quite a lot of challenges to freedom, obviously, that's been posed by COVID-19, particularly the lockdown. The three main ones that I would say that I've particularly noticed has been, one, the challenges to free speech and thought, the second, democracy and accountability, and the third one is personal autonomy. And I'll start off with free speech and thought. I think very early on into the situation, it seemed like there was quite a lot of expectation of ideological conformity, and I think that there are many reasons for that, but part of it I personally do think is quite relational to the long-term challenges to free speech that we've been facing, how a lot of crises that we've faced in recent years have frequently been framed in relation to quite existential, binary and hyperbolic framing of debate. So we saw that with Brexit, which it often became, if you didn't vote this way, you're going to collapse the economy, and all of these really inflammatory notions of what would happen. And we've also seen that with the environmentalist debate, which is if you don't necessarily believe a particular narrative in relation to the environment, then it's akin to destroying the planet and all these types of things. So I think that we've seen a continuation of that very existential fear in relation to how debates are framed. And so anyone that often might be critical of the way in which fear and panic are playing out in the debate are frequently framed as murderers, or many very extreme framing. We saw that with Brendan O'Neill, Peter Hitchens, and many different people. So very early on, there was a kind of huge expectation of conformity and this assumption that there was this one route. And I think that obviously in a democracy, that's always very dangerous. And we saw that with the media demanding a lockdown on social media, people that challenged it were quickly piled on in many significant ways. So I think particularly in the kind of social media age, it's very difficult to be able to put your head above the parapet and stand up. And so if we are living in a democracy, being able to have heterodox thinkers, people that challenge any dominant view or conformity that emerges, keeps us in that dynamic motion and that dialectical process. So that's been something that's been very, very difficult. And I think that post all of this, we need to do a lot of work in terms of raising the level of public debate and creating an environment where people can actually come forward and challenge the dominant narrative without feeling genuinely fearful. And I think that that kind of continues on in relation to the whole democracy and accountability factor, because I think we've seen an emergence of this whole notion of like an expert class who are not necessarily able to be challenged by ordinary people or layman. And if you don't necessarily have particular expertise, then your voice in this particular debate isn't credible. Now, obviously, I think there's significant importance in having experts leading something as new and as complex as a pandemic. But in reality, obviously, any time we're dealing with a societal issue, even if it's medical, it's not something that can necessarily be divorced from the sociological or economic context. And so there are a range of factors that are at play that genuinely and importantly need the involvement of the public and a kind of debate within journalism and many facets of the public to hold that to account. So in terms of just, the fail-safes of our democracy have not even been there at all, whether that's obviously opposition within government, a media that is actually working in dynamic motion with the public, with the government in order to shape. It's been very much pushing a certain agenda, particularly in the lobby journalists. And also within the emergency coronavirus bill, there's protest is not actually allowed. Obviously, again, there's particular reasons for that, but in terms of the particular democratic structures that are in place to prevent the most excesses of potential tyranny, all of them have actually been dismantled. And so that's posed really significant challenges for democracy. And not only that, we've seen an expectation of complicity on the part of the public in relation to the police, asking the public to, snitch on the neighbours and watch for what other people are doing. And so it is quite an unprecedented concoction, which post all of this, I think we absolutely need to be really revisiting how we are ensuring that many of those things that have emerged are not something that ends up being a long-term problem, which often actually happens when emergency bills are passed or when the public are driven in a state of fear and panic. And we've already seen that in Austria, for example. The shops have already been opened, and the public right now are too scared, even though the government have actually said that people can start going out. And so we've really got to be vigilant in terms of not allowing many of those things that have emerged in relation to this particular unprecedented situation to end up being part of our normal life unnecessarily. And then the final thing is just personal autonomy. I think, obviously, again, we're in an unprecedented situation in relation to the government having to spend a lot of money to try and keep people afloat, but having a situation where huge proportions of the population are dependent on the government financially really poses challenges just for the stability of government itself, because many of our things that we talk about and praise, like the NHS and so on, genuinely need a significantly working high tax base to be able to thrive and to be able to survive. And people need a sense of sovereignty and autonomy in their own personal lives to be able to have that relationship with freedom as well. So actually that is something that we need to be really vigilant about. But also it's worrying in terms of the likelihood of people to be able to take risks in the future and be entrepreneurial, given that one of the people that have been hit hardest by this are often small businesses, people that are recent self-employed, people that are in more entrepreneurial types of work. Will this be internalized and it cause us to avoid taking risks in the future? And so I think, those three elements for me are things that I think are really posing challenges for freedom: free speech and thought, democracy and accountability, and having a goalpost to be able to hold government to account. And also one more thing actually in relation to democracy and accountability. If things, I for one, am really, really obviously hoping that the kind of U-turn economically that people talk about will happen. And so this prediction that 35% of the economy will contract or something like that, the economy will contract by 35% won't happen, or at least we'll be able to bounce back quite significantly. But I think if that does happen, which is I really hope obviously doesn't happen, that is some of the most kind of terrifying circumstances for people's daily lives. And realistically, who would be accountable for the endemic suffering that could happen as a result of that? Would it be us individuals, the public, that demanded a lockdown, or will it be the government for actually imposing that on people? And so that line in terms of who is responsible, who is accountable, and how we respond to that situation still isn't clear. And everything's been very myopic and short-term in its thinking, which again is understandable given the nature of a virus that is new. But in terms of thinking, in terms of those more long-term perspectives of how this can actually shape us from a more fundamental level is not being thought of. So I think that poses challenges to freedom. And I'll just close off with
final thing, very final thing, because we need
sorry.
to.
Okay, I'll close off with it's just been interesting seeing liberty conceived of as not necessarily something that is fundamental by virtue of being alive, but liberty conceived of as what the government allows you to do. And I think that those that are in favour of freedom really need to reclaim that intellectual territory going forward. So.
Yes, brilliant. Okay, that's a great final point, actually, in terms of almost like freedom becoming a privilege rather than a right. So I think lots to come back to there. Inaya, thanks very much. So hopefully we should have Jacob.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. So Jacob, over to you.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me, Alastair. It's always a pleasure to be involved with what you do. So most of you probably know the old Benjamin Franklin quote, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. But I would argue that in these circumstances, with the COVID-19 virus, we have seen a situation where actually we have had to sacrifice certain degrees of liberty in order to ensure safety, not just that of our own, but also family, friends, and wider society. And I think most even hardcore civil libertarians will acknowledge that certain degrees of freedom have had to be sacrificed. But I think it's very important to distinguish between which freedoms can justifiably be sacrificed, to which extent, and under which circumstances. Because if you simply say, well, we'll have to sacrifice freedom in order to obtain safety, then say, well, throw freedom completely out the window, then you open up the door for authoritarianism. And we're seeing that mindset being abused wholesale in a lot of countries. So if I were to point at some freedoms that are legitimately restrained during this crisis, then most obviously it's freedom of movement. I think it's quite obvious that social distancing measures work. Here in Denmark, we've been really, I mean, my kids are back in school this week, and that's because social distancing measures were put in place. So restrictions on freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, I think are legitimate in this period. I would also subscribe to, depending on the specific workings of it, certain measures that could help track and trace that you would not normally allow for fears of invasion of privacy and personal data. However, I think it's also extremely important that these restrictions should come with some pretty stringent safeguards. So for instance, if you say, okay, we're gonna allow for restrictions on freedom of assembly, those should be politically neutral. They should not be, for instance, you see in Poland a law now where to target abortion, which is conveniently being pushed at a time where women then are not able to protest them. So you shouldn't abuse the situation. Also, you should not use it in such a way where you say those who are in favor of the government get to meet for political rallies, but we'll use these laws selectively. Obviously, they can and should only be used for the very specific purpose these restrictions were introduced in the first place. So they must be limited in scope so as to avoid abuse. And then obviously there should be sunset clauses in them so that they expire and they don't become permanent. And I think the worst example of a country where this has not been the case is Hungary, where we've seen Viktor Orban not only being able to rule by decree, but also do so without any time limit. But then when it comes to freedom of speech, this is actually one of the rights which I think should not be limited. I think it's absolutely crucial that when we give the government extra powers to curtail freedoms, to do things that we would not ordinarily allow, that we be allowed to scrutinize government and health authorities in whom we put a lot of trust. And this, I would say, should even extend to we see a lot of countries now introducing laws or crackdowns to stop disinformation. In fact, yesterday I released an interview that I did with the vice president from Facebook, who sort of about Facebook's measures online to curb disinformation, and they say that they remove posts that where you risk an imminent harm, but their interpretation of imminent harm includes statements such as if I write, for instance, on Facebook that the working class is immune to COVID-19, that is interpreted by Facebook as a risk of imminent harm, and they'll remove it. Also, they rely on health authorities like the CDC in the US and the WHO in the World Health Organization. And these organizations may have a lot of expertise, they may do a lot of things right, but I think there are instances where we can see that, you know, even experts get it wrong because we don't have the full understanding of this virus. The science is in flux, it's being developed, so what we assume one week might be shown to be faulty the next week. A good example is face masks. So if you go to in late February, the CDC in the US was saying you shouldn't use face masks because they don't protect you. They don't protect the public. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they changed or revised that recommendation. So if you'd gone with the original advice that face masks don't work, then arguably you could say that people who say that they do work, they are engaging in misinformation. When in fact this critical scrutiny of health experts actually turned out to have strong backing and might be better reflecting the available science and data on this. In my own country, Denmark, our health authorities on January 27th said that there was a very low risk of coronavirus spreading to Denmark, even though there were instances of infections in Europe. In February, where a lot of people, where there had been infection clusters of infection in Italy and Austria, people going skiing, our health authorities said, yes, you can go skiing in Italy or Austria, as long as you take a little bit care, wash your hands and so on. And that turned out to be disastrous advice because the vast majority of the initial infections spread out from people coming back from vacations. And up until April the 9th, Danish health authorities said that there was very low risk of people who were asymptomatic being able to infect others, which again is flies in the face of lots of studies. So this is not this is not to say that we should all be tinfoil hats and that we should not have any trust in experts. It's just to say that even experts must be questioned, and sometimes there are actually people out there who are not experts or who may be experts but who are not sitting on with a specific authority, who can contribute and even show flaws in the available guidelines to experts. And that's why I think free speech is absolutely crucial. And I think the role that censorship played in spreading, making this a pandemic, first of all in China, shows to me at least that the risk, the harms of censorship outweighs the potential harms of conspiracy theories, which will, because they're out there in the open, so you can counter them. And I would be very surprised if many people who consider themselves working class would say, oh, well, you know, Jack Johnson on Facebook with 100 followers says that, you know, members of the working class are immune to the virus, so I'm going to go out down to the pub and have a beer with my mates.
So let me just bring you to a close there, Jacob, because I think that's quite a good point to end on in terms of that defence or defence against censorship. I think definitely a point to come back to, but I just want to move on and get right the way through the through the initial speeches just now. So I think next up I had Daniel. I'm going to unmute you, Daniel, now, and I'm going to take the spotlight off Jacob. So Daniel, do you want to go ahead and give us your thoughts, please?
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take a slightly contrary, relaxed view about the restrictions that have been imposed. And I will just say most of my remarks are going to be about Britain, or with Ian following, maybe I should say England, actually. It's very easy to see this in terms of state power, state coercion versus individual liberty. But there is a sort of third element. There are other options as well. And one of them is societal choice. And I think the fact is, at least in Britain, and I think in most European countries, that the vast majority of compliance with the restrictions that have been announced has been entirely voluntary. People want to know what to do in order to keep themselves safe. And the source they're getting their information from mostly is the government. There are some mad ideas out there on Twitter and whatever as to what you can and can't do, but most people are taking the advice of the government, and they're doing so quite voluntarily. And I think that's absolutely fine. That's not an infringement of their freedom. That is a choice which is ill-informed or well-informed, but it's a choice that they're taking on the basis of the information they've got. Inaya talked about Austria and the fact that although the shops were open, people were choosing not to shop in them. Well, I don't see a problem with that. I don't see why it is that people shouldn't be able to go and say, I prefer to conduct myself in a way that at least I think is going to help preserve my health and the health of my family, and that may mean shopping less or shopping not at all for certain sorts of things, or buying things off the internet if that's safer. So I don't think that there's a straightforward dichotomy that we try to pose sometimes between state power and... Now, there are exceptions. There are people, and small shops are an example, who have had their lives and their businesses totally ruined by the government by being told it's simply illegal to open the doors of their shops. But as I say, and as Inaya points out, the good question is, even if they were allowed to open, whether they'd actually have very many customers. The next thing is enforcement, and this is a particularly British or English thing to say, is that the enforcement in Britain has been based on this notion that the police have of policing by consent, which essentially means is the police get terribly excited and do a whole load of things which make them look very silly. And then everyone laughs at them and complains, and they stop doing them. And then yesterday, of course, Thursday rather, they all made total asses of themselves by breaking their own rules, having a party on Westminster Bridge in full public view. So here I think enforcement is not, in at least, nobody's asked to produce bits of paper, nobody's driven back into their homes. I've certainly seen people in my daily walk in Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park, the sort of the mandatory exercise that's now been imposed on us. I'd never have taken any exercise until it actually became something you were only allowed to do once a day. I just see people arguing with the police or taking no notice, and the police are terribly apologetic if they ask you to move on. And I don't think that this is actually coercive. It's more in this pattern that I'm trying to describe of a sort of societal relationship where people are able to make certain sorts of choices, but an awful lot of people are choosing to go with the guidance they're given rather than having it imposed on them. The possibility of the restrictions being extended beyond the time at which they're needed, again, I don't think that's very likely, at least as far as Britain is concerned. Are there any good things? I think, in fact, one of the things that we can all share in now, and again, this is a British point, during the Brexit debate, those of us who supported Brexit were accused of not having any regard for experts. Well, I think nobody has much regard for experts anymore. I mean, first of all, I've discovered that half the population of this country seems to be a professor. There's a different professor on the telly and the radio every 5 minutes. You can get a professor to say anything you want. There'll always be a professor who's got a particular view. None of them have seemed to have any great agreement about what we should be doing. Most people have noticed this. And in fact, I think that the whole notion of expertise as a means of governing society has taken a huge knock on this. And the people who are most, and we even get politicians who are coming forward demanding things that the experts are saying are really, quite useless. But these are politicians who very often campaigned for Remain and mocked those of us who supported Brexit for not adhering to experts. I think the advice of experts. I think the threat, however, that this highlights, if we're going to talk about a threat, is the question of the extent to which people actually want to exercise their freedom, not to want to have freedom in a constitutional sense, but the extent to which people actually want to exercise it. And the truth is, in most of our societies, very few people, I think, really want to exercise freedom in the sense that that implies non-conforming behavior. That's sad, and it's unfortunate, and I think that this experience will encourage that to a certain degree. I'm old enough to remember the generation that looked back fondly on the war, because it was always better in the war. You see, they actually enjoyed wartime restrictions because it meant you didn't have to do much thinking for yourself, and there were no big decisions to make. Just as now, I mean, apart from dying and being born and so on, there isn't actually much you can decide to do. You can't decide to move house because that's not allowed, and so on. All the big things are off the table for the moment. And there's something really rather calming and attractive about that. So I think the danger is that we let people lapse too much into that sort of lethargy. So we need a great sort of provoking of people out there into risk-taking and doing interesting things, and perhaps we should, that's what we should dedicate ourselves to.
Okay, thanks very much, Daniel. That was, again, very useful. So, Ian, I'm going to come to you now. So I've unmuted you, and I'm going to put you in the spotlight. There you go. Off you go.
Well, I agree very much with the sentiments of the previous speakers about the risks of censorship, the dangers posed to freedom of speech, and the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. I'm amazed and slightly horrified at the extent to which we've all become readily accustomed to house arrest, because that is essentially the circumstances under which we are living. It's a form of coercion used by authoritarian states because it keeps you confined, it restricts your movement, it doesn't allow you to associate, and all the rest of it. And also, I mean, in many ways, this is it's the perfect snowflake pandemic, because it's what we've been training for the last 30 years in a society of extreme risk aversion, when young people are being kept at home because of the nebulous risk of them being exposed to pedophiles if they go outside the door, and to the whole way in which popular culture has, in a sense, been training us for exactly this. Similarly, I don't like the idea of having a policeman in my mobile phone, which is probably what we'll have to put up with once I get around to proper contact tracing and isolating. However, at the same time, while these are practices used by authoritarian governments, and authoritarian governments are exploiting these circumstances very clearly, as we've seen in China, as we've seen in Hungary, and we've seen in Turkey, where there, if you say something that the government determines is fake news, then you can be punished by 5 years imprisonment. So the risks are extremely potent and present. However, at the same time, I mean, as far as the lockdown is concerned, I'd have to confess to being pretty much a lockdown agnostic. In fact, when the decision was taken, I think it was very difficult for the government to do anything else. And it's significant that both the Scottish government, which regards itself as very left-wing and nationalistic, is in exactly the same boat as the UK Tory government at the moment, with Boris Johnson, who's been a hate figure for the SNP government for many years. And that's because they basically were trying to respond to the same situation as best they could. And I give them a certain degree of credit for that. I also think that our willingness to subject these to these restrictions on our freedom is, in a sense, strangely inspiring, because it does counter the rather misanthropic view, which is very current at the moment, particularly in the ecological left, that we are just a society of isolated consumers obsessed by possessive individualism. We've lost any sense of community. We've lost any sense of altruism and social purpose. And clearly, what most people are doing is out of altruism. They want to help. They want to get out and do what they can to help their fellow citizens. And we saw that when the government asked for 250,000 volunteers to help out the NHS, and they got 750,000, and now they don't know what to do with them. I mean, yeah, we do have to, as I said, it's eternal vigilance. We have to be very careful about how governments seek to exploit it. We've already seen in Scotland, in its emergency legislation, the Scottish government tried to abolish jury trials, which is something that many of its politicians would like to do, for example, in rape cases. And they had to be stopped from doing that by action in the Scottish Parliament, which brought this to light and prevented it happening. What the parliamentarians didn't prevent happening, however, is restrictions on freedom of information requests, which are they're now basically saying freedom of information requests will only be answered after 10 months. So clearly they're exploiting this situation, trying to move journalists who are obviously pumping out lots of freedom of information requests at the moment. They've basically clamped down on that by saying you won't get it for at least 10 months. And of course, they will try, as politicians do, as governments do, to try to carry over many of these measures after this whole crisis is over. But as far as the fake news is concerned, I don't regard fake news as a particular problem in this regard. Actually, I don't think many of the conspiracy theories have really got off the ground. What I find more objectionable is fake interpretation and the attempt to try to map ideological positions onto what's been happening. But I'm quite gratified that, in fact, that has been very difficult to do. We saw initially how almost the Brexit debate was kind of taken and applied wholesale to the coronavirus crisis, and they said that the Tory government was pursuing British exceptionalism and that it was trying to introduce measures which were basically about social Darwinism and about trying to promote Britain as being a global power through these measures. But it hasn't worked. I mean, people like AC Grayling, who was talking about Boris Johnson as being the bad butcher of Downing Street, have kind of made a fool of themselves. It's very difficult to say that herd immunity, which is just an epidemiological truism, but it's become a kind of ideological argument, that people tried to present herd immunity as being a kind of Tory form of social Darwinism, that this was designed or to permit the removal of old people who are a burden on the state and a burden on the public purse. And in some way, this corresponded to conservative view of the world. I think that has been shown to be totally ridiculous. As I say, we have an extraordinary position where both the Scottish Nationalist Party and Boris Johnson are in the same boat, and they're probably going to sink there, because of course, what has happened is that on the guidance of their scientists and all the medical advisors, CMOs and the National Science Advisor and the National Clinical Director, in March they allowed community testing and contact tracing to be halted. And in Germany, they didn't do that. In Germany, they carried on with community testing and contact tracing. And not only that, they located people who had early stages of the disease, monitored them, and as soon as they got into difficulties, they were taken straight to hospital in corona taxis. And that has had a definite impact, because we see that the death rate in Germany is considerably less. It's about a third of what it has been here. Now, this may all change in the second and third wave of this pandemic, but the narrative is now stuck. And that's been hung around both the governments in Scotland and the governments in the UK. We won't know really about the impact on freedom for at least 2 years until we know what happens to this pandemic. But we always have to be careful because, well, the pandemic of fear is always worse than the fear of pandemic.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ian. That was really useful. So finally, I'm going to unmute Claire and put you in the spotlight, and we'll get your thoughts. Off you go.
Really useful comments from my fellow panelists. One of the greatest threats to freedom at present, I think, is the association of bad ideas with actual loss of life. We've had a situation where but now we're in a situation where anything that challenges sticking to lockdown rules is accused of physically endangering people. So, for example, when the coronavirus bill was brought in and giving the government extraordinary powers, as has been discussed, I made a fairly mild challenge suggesting that we definitely needed a sunset clause. And although the government actually agreed to that sunset clause in the end, other people accused me of having a death wish. Lockdown skeptics and their ideas are accused of inciting the genocide of the elderly. And the other day, because I defended them, I was accused of supporting a death cult. So I think that's pretty difficult for us. I'm not arguing against the lockdown, as Ian is. I'm a bit more agnostic. I might prefer the trust model of Sweden. But we can all consent to the temporary restriction of freedom as a short-term act of social solidarity to protect life. I'm kind of happy with that. But I would prefer that there was a bit more discomfort, a bit of bristling at the idea that we hand over our freedoms, that we're a bit more on guard, and that we should constantly be demanding to know if and why it's necessary, when it will end, and so on. And I think there has been a revelation in this that our attachment to freedom and liberty is pretty fragile. And I think that that's particularly become clarified for me around our attitude to dissenting views. There's a sort of fairly well-known dissenters, but I wanted to just refer to Laura Perrins. Laura Perrins is the co-editor of Conservative Women and a former barrister, not somebody I consider to be a big revolutionary of any description on anything. But she put out a tweet recently where she said the extended lockdown is not lawful, the PM is incapacitated and didn't make the decision, Parliament isn't sitting, the original aim of the first lockdown has been met, and civil disobedience would be justified. Now, I was surprised as anyone that Laura Perrins will be arguing for civil disobedience, but the treatment of her and the reaction to that tweet has been incredibly dangerous, I think, and revealing. She's been labelled as a crackpot truther, a lockdown denier, a batshit crazy conspiratorial thinker. And I think that strikes me as being dangerous because we have a situation where any deviation or challenge to a particular orthodoxy is met with a certain shut up fury, and any expressed concern about our democratic freedoms, even if they're not as extreme as Laura Perrins, is casually dismissed or vehemently denounced, and more people are being accused of conspiracy mongering. Now, I use the conspiracy mongering point because there is definitely a problem of conspiracy theories at the moment. They're pretty widespread. And I'm worried about that as much as anyone. But also the label conspiracy theorist is also broadening. Recently, Hope Not Hate brought out a report about last week about the prevalence of 5G conspiracy theories. And there has definitely been an exponential growth of the idea of 5G. There was 50 arson attacks over the Easter weekend. There's lots of Facebook groups linked to it, somehow linking coronavirus to Bill Gates being malevolent and anti-vaxxers and so on. But a couple of points to note about what Hope Not Hate concluded from all this. They managed to fit their critique of the 5G conspiracy theories into a neat box of their usual suspect villains. So they said that 5G conspiracy theorists were all far right, anti-Semitic, social media and some of their own activists made the jump to say that all conspiracy theories are Trump supporters, Brexiteers, and obviously racists. And I wanted to just draw attention to the fact that the culture wars, which you'd think might have been sidelined by this pandemic, have actually become a feature of it. And whilst Ian is absolutely right to say people don't fit into straightforward boxes as people try to do it, it doesn't mean that there isn't a kind of culture war element to this. And it also has meant that dissenters or anyone who even asks questions are often delegitimized as conspiracy theorists. Because, of course, inevitably, hope not hate, solution to conspiracy theories around 5G is to call for more censorship, more bans, the removal of offensive content, and increasing credence being given to Facebook and big tech companies as some kind of ministry of truth. So Facebook posts can now be banned, as Jacob mentioned, and just to use a quote, if they incite mistrust, not just of the government, but of healthcare providers, scientists and public institutions. Well, that's a hell of a catch-all and a lot of people in that. So effectively, it targets as any dissents or any questioning of healthcare providers or scientists as problematic and puts them into the same box as conspiracy theorists. I wanted to just note, to finish off with, what I think about conspiracy theories, if I might. Because I think that conspiracy theories that have actually become much more mainstreamed, it's not just 5G people. If you look at some of the anti-Tory, Boris wasn't really ill, they let him out on Easter Sunday so that it looked like he was Jesus type theories that are coming from, would you believe it, economist journalists and FT journalists. So it's not exactly crackpot territory. Then actually, I think that kind of conspiratorial mindset perhaps talks to an immaturity in the way society wants to deal with uncertainty. You know, there's a temptation to want easy answers and certainty and a narrative that simplifies why and how things are happening. But I also think that there's a danger that in our reaction against conspiracy theories, that people who are arguing to silence them are also going down the road of wanting absolute certainty. Because there's a danger that in clamping down on views that are considered to be dangerous, that we actually prescribe a complexity. There's also kind of a preaching of easy answers, as though there's only one sure way of tackling this pandemic. And I think that I'm nervous that what's being fueled here is a sort of fatalism, where individual agency and autonomy and sovereignty are sidelined so that we let others decide. I mean, Daniel described it as maybe people don't want to exercise their freedom, but I think the mood is that that you should not exercise your freedom intellectually, and the notion is that if to be a good citizen, you have to follow passively and do what you're told. And I think that whilst we might consent to giving up some freedoms, that climate is dangerous for freedom. I think, just to
Final
finish,
point, Claire,
that we need as wide a series of views as possible. We need to guard against our own tendencies for confirmation bias and embracing dogma. I think that we should read alternative views because they're an antidote to fixed orthodoxies. And I'm worried about a kind of blind faith in one strategy. I think we just keep having to ask, am I wrong? Should I reevaluate? If a government's taking the wrong path, they must be given the space to change their course. And I think I'm calling for a bit of humility. We shouldn't just assume that our strongly held views are correct. I think that it can, of course, feel demoralizing that there's so much information out there. We want to trust somebody. We don't like gotcha journalism and cynicism, but actually living freedom must mean a responsibility for free thinking and being open-minded. And that, I'm afraid, means even defending conspiracy mongers.